Freedom has numerous interpretations and connotations. For some, it's to do as one pleases without constraint. Meanwhile, others perceive freedom as the absence of interference within the confines of organized society. The former understanding suggests a world lacking organized entities, a sort of all versus all, as Thomas Hobbes once phrased it in his Leviathan. The latter interpretation appears more feasible, a modified freedom where people can pursue their respective interests without inhibiting the other. As these two examples demonstrate, freedom isn't so black and white. There's a profound gray area that varies between each person and their values. A priority question that arises in discussions surrounding freedom goes like this. Is there a price to freedom? In other words, just like progress demands sacrifice for its price, what does freedom demand? This is what will be explored in today's discussion. I'll begin with an example that most people, if not everyone, is familiar with. Recall the time when you progressed from a teenager into a young adult. Some of you moved out of your parents' place right away, eager to venture out on your own, whereas the rest of you were reluctant to do so, and it took more time before that finally happened. Regardless of your situation, many of you likely strived for the independence that young adulthood brought. Work provided you with some disposable income, and you wouldn't have to ask mom or dad to purchase things anymore. You gained increased financial freedom from before, along with less constraints on your movements to a certain extent. However, you quickly realized something, a truth with consequential implications. You've become more independent and have acquired freedom, but it came at a price. That price was responsibility. The price of freedom, then, is responsibility. You realize that your choices have consequences, and those consequences directly affect you. When you were younger and had to rely on your parents for support, you could defer many responsibilities and decisions to them. If circumstances went poorly, then it wouldn't ultimately reflect on you, since it wasn't your decision. However, as you've grown older, this is no longer the case. Your freedom and the ability to exercise it comes with the burden of responsibility. To be responsible is to acknowledge that your decisions have consequences, and that you'll face those consequences, whether they are beneficial or detrimental. The problem, as we all know, is that this never happens 100% of the time, for a plethora of reasons. Even so, striving to exercise freedom wisely should be sought in all of the decisions you make. Other examples could have been used, but the example above is merely one case to illustrate the importance of accepting that freedom itself isn't free from burden. We have freedoms, but we also have obligations to exercise those freedoms responsibly, lest we attract negative attention, or worse, lose them. So, does this mean that we should defer our freedom and ability to make decisions to someone else or another entity? Of course not. Proponents of a larger government might think we should. But the main issue is that deferring or severely limiting freedoms and placing them in the hands of someone else doesn't automatically suggest that safety will arise. Sacrificing freedom in the name of safety means you'll eventually get neither, not to mention that it also presents a slippery slope towards authoritarianism. One need only look to the last century for evidence of that phenomenon. Anyhow, the point of this discussion isn't to get into the specifics of the freedom versus safety debate. The message is more along the lines of realizing that freedom demands sacrifice. You and I can shout from the rooftops that we want as much freedom as possible, but are we prepared for the implications? If existing structures collapse and society becomes a place where it's all against all, would we be prepared for it? Even if society doesn't collapse anytime soon, are we responsible enough to accept the burden of freedom as it pertains to every aspect of our lives? To conclude now, the answer to the previous question once again relates to the individual, to their character and temperament. Some have already acknowledged this fact and take responsibility for their choices exercised through free will. Meanwhile, there is still a great deal who loudly proclaim their desire for freedom, but exercise it poorly and in a manner that does no good to everyone else who stands by freedom. At the end of the day, though, your choices will define you, and you'll have to face the music at some point. Freedom demands responsibility as its price, so use it wisely.